about aging and curling, and the title of my talk is Aging Rocks, What Curling Teaches Us About Successful Aging. So a good place to start might be to think about what curling can tell us about aging, aging bodies, and what it might mean to age well. Over the past 3 years, I've used the sport of curling to explore current ideas about aging, sport, and the lives of older men. Curling, I think, is an interesting sport to explore themes related to aging in Canada for a number of reasons. Within Canadian popular culture, it's one of few sports linked to the bodies of older people. Canadian magazines like Senior City, for example, list curling as one of only 2 age-appropriate winter activities for those over 50 years. While other publications note that it's a sport designed for those in later life, or in the words of a prominent Canadian reporter, a sport you can keep for a lifetime. Of course, these publications aren't wrong. Curling is one of the only Canadian sports where the nation might come together to celebrate the bodies of older people. This includes people like Russ Howard, Canada's oldest Olympic medalist at 50 years. As a result of curling's appeal for older people, it's attracted new growth in the country. For example, in 2014, the governing body for curling in British Columbia noted that people over the age of 55 years now comprise the largest group of newcomers to the sport. While my own research in Ontario and New Brunswick suggests that older people are the anchors of their curling club, keeping up arenas, mentoring young and new curlers, and taking leadership roles in club governance. So where does this come from? Well, let's start at the beginning. Curling has long been associated with older adults, and until quite recently celebrated a unique form of what I'd call sports masculinity. In the 19th century and beyond, curling was associated with later life men and their wise, thoughtful, and moral expressions of masculinity. The media and public noted that curling men could have stout bodies, but more importantly, it required them to demonstrate a commitment to high moral character. In the words of one reporter, a curler should be, and I quote, a gentleman of mature age and portly stature, standing with a huge broom in his hands. This is, of course, quite a bit different to the young, fit, hard bodies that you might recognize in other elite athletes that are widely celebrated in popular culture. As many curlers will attest, the unique culture of curling, at least historically, demonstrates a relative indifference to physicality and serious devotion to physical training. In other words, you don't have to be buff to be competitive. The sport also privileges a kind of ethic tied to good etiquette and friendliness. This is outlined on a popular curling t-shirt that says, "My drinking team has a curling problem." In my work, I examine the ways that curlers' unique sports culture offers older men some distinctive ways to express themselves in later life. Given the structure of curling, a sport where men and women can and often do play together, where modified versions of the game exist alongside as well as within non-modified versions, where different forms of masculinity are celebrated, and where the bodies of those in later life can become symbols of the nation, I argue that this sport should be taken seriously, as it provides us with new and innovative ways to understand what it might mean to age well as broaden new imperatives tied to active aging that privilege those in later life who are in good health, able-bodied, constantly busy, and independent. Through a series of interviews with later life curlers in Ontario and New Brunswick, I explored the unique meanings that older men brought to their curling experiences. Although many of the curlers in this work position themselves in conversation with Canada's other national winter sport, or of course hockey, they use curling to assert a new form of aging masculinity, one that distinguished them from the rough, tough styles often associated with the hockey practices of young men. One participant told me, and I quote, "It's a different mindset. Hockey is very aggressive. The nice thing about curling," he said, "is it's aggressive in a different way. It's not physically aggressive. It's mentally aggressive." For these older curlers, it was important that their physical activity not cause disability or impede the functioning of their bodies. So although they had played hockey in their younger days, curling was cited as the activity of choice for those in later life. Hockey, for later life curling men, was misaligned with both successful aging as well as dominant forms of masculine expression. Participants even frequently associated hockey with serious injury, disability, and death. As one participant stated, well, I don't want to go to hockey heaven. For these curlers, hockey was to be avoided due to its risk to the functionality of the body, potentially leading to head and spinal injuries, heart attacks, backaches, and other impairments that would obstruct their ability to engage in meaningful active aging activities. So one of the things they did embrace was modified curling, right? Men in this study not only maintained their sense of normative masculinity through the rejection of hockey, but they also embraced the functionality of their bodies through the celebration of modified curling practices like stick and wheelchair curling. Stick curling, for those of you who don't know, allows curlers to release a stone from the standing position and allows people with physical disabilities to play or to stay in the game after changes in their mobility. Curlers celebrated stick curling as an appropriate modification of the game that allowed them to maintain functional fitness and active aging strategies. Many of those I spoke to reminded me that curlers just needed to, quote, drop their pride and pick up the stick. As several curlers pointed out, the celebration and destigmatization of stick curling allowed older men to embrace a style of play that they may one day need to adopt themselves. In the words of one participant, Wayne, he said, "I would never disparage a stick curler because it may happen to me one day." "Oh, no, he said. "I can't go along with that." So as aging men's bodies frequently struggled to maintain some of the markers of celebrated masculinity that might have marked their earlier life, curlers found new ways of asserting masculinity, including for some, accepting much more diverse expressions of sport, such as modified practices like stick curling. Of course, the curling club is also important to the culture of curling. It's an important place for allowing these unique expressions of masculinity to exist. It was a space that allowed men to celebrate modified sports practices and a kind of nurturing not often spoken about in other men's team sports spaces. Importantly, the actual space of the curling club and the etiquette associated with the sport, or an etiquette that encourages members to spend time both with their teammates and competitors before and after matches, that privileged the work of aging men through their prominent positions in the club, and created networks of masculinity built on caring and closeness, really allowed for unique expressions of aging masculinity. Camaraderie, in this regard, is built right into the culture of the game, the structure of its rules, and of course reflected in the physical space of curling clubs in ways that allowed curlers to develop friendship, care, and interdependence. As one curler told me, the men don't usually curl here until 11, and from 9:30 through to 11:30, you have a steady stream of people, and there are usually 2 or 3 tables you can't get a chair around. There's a big, intense conversation about nothing. It could be about curling, it could be about politics, it could be about grandchildren. Clubs are frequently constructed with large kitchens and bars. They have ample seating for people to sit around and watch the games. And this structure encourages curlers to linger before and after matches to enjoy coffee or, of course, beer, depending on the hour, and as a result, appear to generate a different kind of sports culture than other sporting spaces. Many of the research participants valued the social time that came with curling culture and celebrated as a time to reflect on and discuss their aging bodies and to celebrate diverse ways of being older men. More than this, curling allowed men to conceptualize new ways of being active community members in later life. Several participants remarked on the oldest members of the curling club celebrating with awe the achievements of late-life curlers who came to their club in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and even beyond. Unlike other kinds of active aging, the sort expressed by curlers did not entirely disavow old age. Instead, it found room to celebrate ways of being active, and I would argue actually aging well. For example, members of the curling club celebrated teammates who continued to come to the club and curl in spite of cognitive impairments. One participant named William described the situation with one of the men he curled with. He explained that his teammate's wife had trained a couple of people to curl with her husband after he'd been recently diagnosed with dementia. He observed that if you curl with him, you just remind him what color his rock is. Well, George celebrated curling with men of differing abilities and health concerns, telling me the first year doing it, they paired me with someone with Alzheimer's, which was interesting. Now I'm with another guy who's got some health issues. I knew him, and we went away to a couple of stick bonspiels, and it was a great time. He'd never done something like that before, so he thought it was great. Don, another participant who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease several years before our interview, spoke with great pride about the relationship he had with another member of his curling club. This was a relationship where they could come in the morning, talk about their health, their medication, and how they were feeling that day. Don enjoyed the idea that as his Parkinson's progressed, he might be able to continue curling even in a wheelchair, and he came to the club for coffee and conversation even on days when his sciatica made curling actually impossible. All right, so what's the moral of this story? What lessons can we take away from this kind of academic research? Or specifically, what can curling tell us about aging and aging research? Presently, sociologists are concerned about the predominance of active or successful aging discourse produced in popular culture by the state, health professionals, and others as just common sense. We argue that this work suggests that to age well means to really not age at all. Specifically, active aging discourse embraces independence, constant activity, rigorous exercise, and suggests that aging well, you must emulate the body styles associated with young people. As sociologist Elizabeth Pike points out, this active aging discourse is linked to new moral panics about the West's aging population and works to present these populations as really simply just problematic. In this regard, people in later life are encouraged to demonstrate their social value through almost constant activity. Not only does active aging work to marginalize large portions of our population, but it also limits the ways we come to understand what aging well might actually look like or mean. In this regard, curling's focus on inclusive physical activity, the celebration of diverse bodies, particularly those linked to older people, physical ability and disability, and importantly, through the structures of curling clubs, one that encourages interdependence instead of celebrating independence, we might see diverse as well as interdependent ways to truly celebrate successful aging. Thank you.